Now, first of all, my apologies. There's no handout because I just about got here on time. There have been certain events in the Muslim world which has meant air travel is once again unpleasant, difficult, and actually has real security operatives checking your passport now. So, and also the flight was dreadful, so I'm slightly deaf. So if I'm not projecting my voice correctly, please let me know. What I've been doing recently, I've got a long sabbatical thanks to the generosity of the Leuven Trust, is textual edition of this text, working through the numerous copies of this. So at the moment I'm a bit like a mole peering out into the light. Really what I've been doing is thinking whether quay really should be at the end of this word or not. But presentations are great like this because they actually force me to ask questions of what I'm doing. So in a way, a lot of what this is me talking to myself, trying to answer the questions that really I should be answering in general about this particular text. I should also say, just in the background, that I'm a Hispanist, so I work above all on medieval Spain. So our story starts in circumstances that are probably quite familiar to you. Not the Hijaz with its clashes of arms and the rustle of Gabriel's dictation to Muhammad. Not the blood-soaked battlefields of Spain, where the Cid, pretending to be Charlton Heston, scattered heads far and wide. We'll get on to that. I can see people smiling because it's such a pleasure to be able to mention the Cid and Charlton Heston. Because if you do it to students nowadays, they look at you and say, "What? Charlton? What? Is that a football team?" But rather, where we're going to start is an economic crisis, the threat, indeed the reality, of budgeting for austerity, cuts, services in danger. Yes, I'm referring to the late 1030s and the monastery of Cluny. The greatest monastery in Christendom, setter of the gold standard for monastic observance and proud mother of over 2,000 daughter houses stretching across Christendom. The gold in the treasury had been depleted, and money to fix the roof had been frittered away on a huge building project. This, the third abbatial church to stand on the site. A fitting expression of the abbey's, or perhaps the order's, grandeur, here depicted on suitable gold leaf. Under the abbot Hugh. Hugh bigger than everyone else. It's great. Cluny had been very rich. Wealth and liturgical observance that depended, in large part, on the census sent by the monarchs of Leon Castile, who, through their pressure on the weakened Muslim statelets in Spain, here, just after the collapse of the Caliphate of Cordoba, central power weakens in Spain after the year 1000, until eventually, 1030 really, it all collapses, and the governors of the individual provinces extend their rule and become independent kings. Now, the rulers of Leon Castile, the kingdom of Leon there stretching into Galicia, through what was essentially a protection racket, had cash to burn, or at least large amounts of gold to send to assure Cluny's spiritual and diplomatic support. Fernando I, self-styled Emperor of the Spains, which earned him the rebuke of the Pope, sent 1,000 auri to Cluny annually, perhaps the last 12 years of his life. The 1,000 gold pieces was a tenth of what he received from the kingdom of Saragossa alone every year. And here, as numismatics is a bit of an obsession with me, are two of the sort of things that would have been sent. Caliph Hisham was the last of the caliphs. That's the final year of his reign, 1031. He was assassinated, but was really completely powerless by that point as well. And this rather more interesting one from Valencia, the fragmentary. It's actually been cut to pieces, been cut off. And in northern Spain, but not in the south of Spain, in northern Spain, pieces, auri or solidi, were usually just bits of gold or bits of silver. They didn't have a coin currency. So when they're actually trying to describe what they're getting from the Muslims, they have to use all kinds of rather archaic language to describe it, what the coins are. So, he received 1,000 from Saragossa, and this would seem to be also what he also got from the kingdoms of Toledo, Seville, possibly Valencia, and Badajoz. So this census to Cluny ceased after his death, and the customary sibling struggle afterwards, when his sons inherited the various kingdoms he had brought under his personal rule, left Christian Spain in a period of internecine war for 7 years. Eventually, though, the victoriously remaining son, Alfonso VI, after a gap of 12 years, started the census again. Alfonso had, in the meantime, also added Granada to the list of those having had an offer they could not refuse, and paying the going rate, 10 to 12,000 per annum. 10,000 was about 70 slaves. You paid 1 gold coin to enter Jerusalem in 1060. Now, such financial backing encouraged Abbot Hugh of Cluny to be in work on the most splendid church in Christendom in 1080, speeded on by Alfonso's doubling of the census in 1090, for which Hugh was prepared to traverse the Pyrenees and go as far as Burgos to confirm. In 1085, Alfonso had taken Toledo and annexed its kingdoms into his. So Hugh came from Cluny, but Alfonso had uses for Cluniacs too. The bishop of newly conquered Toledo, installed 1086, was originally from that monastery, Bernard of Sedirac, but had been placed as abbot of the royal monastery or pantheon of Sahagún, which is just next to Leon, in 1080. The good times continued in Cluny, not without strain, until 1010, when the census lapsed at the death of Alfonso VI. The good times in Spain had ceased around the turn of the century, when the Iberian monarchies began to feel the pinch of having a new Islamic superpower on the doorstep. The Almoravids, who, after coming to the assistance of their co-religionists over the Straits of Gibraltar after the fall of Toledo, well, they found the Iberian Muslims to be not Muslim enough, and solved that problem by annexing the south of Spain to their holdings closer to the Sahara. Cluny entered a period of serious upheaval. Abbot Pons, Hugh's successor, was deposed in relatively unclear circumstances after 11 years in office. Pons' successor lasted but a few months. He was succeeded by Pierre de Montboissier, or, as is known to history, Peter the Venerable. When Peter was absent, involved in what became a running battle with St. Bernard of the Cistercians, Pons returned in 1124 to take up the abbacy. He was excommunicated by the local bishop, died in prison in Rome 2 years later. Cluny's dire economic state, having relied overmuch on easy money from abroad and not paid enough attention to its own lands, would have made Peter look to Spain for help. And Alfonso VII, in the early 1140s, needed help. He wanted Cluny's support for his candidate to the see of Santiago de Compostela, which was already a booming site of pilgrimage. And he sent his bishop of Osma, Stephen, to invite Peter to come. Osma too had Cluniac connections. Its first bishop Peter was from the Abbey, and he came to Osma via Toledo. Peter, here are a couple of probable portraits, needed no encouragement to regain something like the census, and set out on a long trek down to what was previously El Dorado as winter changed into spring in 1042. He would have crossed at the epically framed Roncesvalles and progressed from Pamplona to Estella along the pilgrimage route to Santiago and on to the major Cluniac house of Santa Maria de Nájera. There. He then went to the other Cluniac houses, following the way of St. James, reaching Astorga, and waited there for his interview with Alfonso VII, who was busy besieging Muslim Coria. It's 100 kilometers to the southwest of Salamanca itself. You can just see there at the back the remains of one of the Muslim doorways into the city. We should now backtrack to the initial part of Peter's journey through Spain. At some point, he came across Peter of Toledo, and having translated Disputation against the most dreadful, wicked heresy of Muhammad. This is, in fact, the apology of Al-Kindi. This is, Al-Kindi is a Christian writer, not to be confused with the Muslim philosopher. This apology of Al-Kindi is a rumbustious rejection of all things Mahometan that had served the Christians of the East well for several centuries. It is no surprise, given the florid literary culture of Toledo's Arabic-speaking Christians, to find it held dear there. And Peter of Toledo was very much the Spanish Montserrat. Although Peter the Venerable claimed in the letter, introducing the works, that this Peter was learned in both languages, he immediately has to backtrack, saying that Peter T knew Arabic, but didn't really know Latin. And so he's had to have his secretary, whose name, as you would now expect, was Peter, but Peter of Poitiers, so Peter P, to lend a hand, judging from the words used, probably via dictation. And via dictation through verba latina. Latina is a good word there. Probably the conservative Romance dialect spoken in Toledo. Now, Peter T may well have been part of the welcoming party sent by Alfonso VII, and so he may have met Peter V at any point at the Roncesvalles. It is clear that the two Peters were working together in a complementary fashion. But a second phase of the project comes about when Peter the Venerable comes across, inveining, as he says, or possibly recruits, two professional scientific translators, neither of which, rather fortunately, were called Peter. Robert of Ketton, an Englishman, and Herman of Dalmatia. Well, wars to be fought about that. Ketton is probably to be identified with a village in Rutland, famous, after Robert's day, for its cement works, which is enormous. Herman was also known as being from Carinthia, so it came from the intersection of German, Italian, Slavic, and Byzantine worlds. Robert and Herman knew each other. In fact, they were a team already, who were involved in a long-seen project working up, via various translations, to translate Ptolemy's Almagest via other works. And here you have a 14th century illustration, Ptolemy on one side and Herman of Carinthia on the other. Peter found them circa Ibero, it's in the Ebro Valley, near the Ebro. As you can see, the Ebro, which starts up close to the Atlantic coast, cuts all the way across Spain, through Saragossa, which is all in Muslim hands, and down to below Barcelona. Most of that was still then not held by Christians, although Saragossa tended to be slightly more favourable towards Christians than the rest of Muslim Spain. The most reasonable supposition is he met them either in Pamplona, where Robert became an archdeacon the following year, or in Santa Maria de Nájera, where Peter may have spent some time. Very little remains of the Romanesque buildings on the site, The current building, as you can see, is at late 15th century, but still built into the cliff face, which is characteristic of these church monasteries of La Rioja. But it already had a pantheon of the kings of Pamplona. The capitals and tomb, you can see, were manufactured just after Peter's visit. The tomb is of Alfonso VII's mother, Dona Blanca. The monastery itself will probably have looked something rather like this. This is the monastery of Irache in Aragon. But it also ruled over two other monasteries slightly further to the south, Torrecilla, San Pedro de Torrecilla and San Andrés de Cigüeña. Rioja, even then, was very, very prosperous. Founded on the fertility of its soil, its heavily wooded area still, they all disappeared, but then it was still heavily wooded, and, crucially, its vineyards. It was famed for the production of wine, even from this point. Now, Robert and Hammond were the ideal pairing for the series of translations that was planned. Not only the Quran that concerns us here, but doctrinal and historical works as well. One of these, by Herman, was completed in Leon, the account of Muhammad's forebears, the De Generatione Mahomet. And so it is likely that the project was, in fact, a communal effort, and the translators accompanied Peter as he progressed through Spain. And a lot of work was probably done in Astorga as they waited for Alfonso's successful return from the siege and their summoning down to Salamanca, where Peter the Venerable could negotiate about the return of the census or something in its stead. Indeed, Peter of Poitiers very possibly remained in Spain after the abbot had returned to France before the winter snows closed the passes, and he reports how he conferred with both Peter of Toledo and Robert of Ketton over various Mohammedan customs that seemed too far-fetched for words. It's important to say that Peter the Venerable contracts the translators as he arrived in Spain. Whatever he did very, very quickly. It's also true that he didn't, at that point, have any serious settlement for Alfonso VII. So whereas when he returned from Spain, he made quite a killing, really. When he decided to pay them to do this, and he paid them quite a lot, he says, he was actually digging into Cluny's funds. So the scene set for the first Western translation of the Quran. There may have been a Demotic Greek translation a century earlier, of which only fragments remain. But what we are here considering is the first complete translation to have survived, and one which gives the Quran a certain literary status, in that it is rendered into Demotic Greek, but literary Latin, and provided with commentary and glosses. Even though the project does indeed look as if it would have been the ideal large grand project, with scholars in constant contact with each other as the work progressed, Robert and Herman provided individual prologues to their translations, thereby making a claim to their responsibility for them. That's why we talk about Robert of Ketton's Quran, because it's his prologue that begins it, although Peter does say that they work together on the translation. Robert was particularly sensitive to his role in translating the Quran. He had, after all, a reputation as a serious scholar to maintain. He also had an ecclesiastical career he was waiting for, which came about with his eventual archdeaconry in Pamplona, and, after that was lost due to his own role in political intrigues, a canonry in Tudela in 1157. He presumably died soon afterwards. His own interests, he avers in the prologue to the translation of the Quran, were for astronomy and geometry, and goes on to promise Peter a book on the planetary spheres, but is aware of possible criticisms. Again, in the prologue, he insists it was not his own idea to hide poison with flowers or gild a vile and debased object. But note that this description of his work is to avoid stylistic criticism. Perhaps he had enough of Peter of Poitiers looking over his shoulder and improving his text, which was precisely the role he played not only for Peter of Toledo, but also Peter the Venerable, his abbot. Robert, in his defence, also notes that, since Peter the Venerable would be involved in a refutation of the text, this translation would serve to show the superiority of our faith. In the prologue to the other translation associated with him, A History of Muhammad and the First Four Caliphs, he also uses the image of poison. It was perhaps a suitably scientific means of expression. What then of this translation of the Quran? How is it transmitted? Well, we've seen 3 manuscripts so far. The Arsenal manuscript, which is the first one we saw, is generally considered to be perhaps the version brought out of Spain, but probably is actually a very early copy elaborated at Cluny. It's the only copy to bear the very Romanesque depiction of Muhammad as perhaps a fish in with a man's head on the very first page of Hermann's De Generatione Mahomet. There's the whole page, the detail. Some of the others have a space, and most have nothing at all. That's not at all surprising, because the text was distributed as an academic text, and as anyone knows who's trying to publish an academic text, illustrations cost money. Now, these texts were assembled and copied at Cluny and sent, in the first instance, to Bernard of Clairvaux, accompanied by the letter I mentioned at the start, which gave details about how the translations were put together. Peter's idea was to gain Bernard's interest in writing a refutation of Islam using the material at hand. Probably the original manuscript from Spain went to Bernard. Peter failed in his attempt, and Bernard put all his energies into preaching the Second Crusade. But that did not stop the collection being copied and distributed from Cluny. It was essentially published from Cluny. It should be clear at this point that the translation was not a disinterested exercise. It was designed to produce a groundwork for a refutation of Islam. However, for this to work, some form of accurate translation was going to be needed, which is why Peter the Venerable turned to professional translators trained on science manuscripts. Almost certainly, Peter of Toledo could have done the job in an approximate way, which Peter of Poitiers could have polished and cleaned up as they went along. Nor was the primary aim to produce a ridiculous version of the Quran, that is, one which purposely set out to exaggerate elements. They seem to have really thought that they didn't need to do that. And in many places, as Robert of Ketton says, it spoke for itself. The translation is not word for word. It is in itself an interpretation. Indeed, a literal translation was prepared in Spain just under 100 years later, but that was explicitly designed as a contrasting crib to be read together with Robert's translation. Robert also, of course, was using the Spanish Muslims' Quran, the recension of Wash, still common in North Africa, and which in several ways is distinct from that of the Hafs, which is the most commonly accepted or used one today, apart from North Africa. Secondly, he took groups of 10 verses, which he divided by an unusual paraf sign, and which represent liturgical recitative divisions in the Quranic text as more or less units. So, to make a complete Latin phrase, we would move elements of verses around. We can take, as an illustration of this, the very first verses preserved in the Arsenal manuscript. It happens all the way through the text. There's a gathering missing from the Arsenal manuscript, it's fallen out. We have the first verses that we get. As you can see, the greatest evil and the future threatens them is actually right at the end of verse 7. But Robert moves that around to give a much nicer rhythm and also to make it clear where it refers to. So that's just a few verses. Let's expand to a full view of the page. That's the first page we have. Now, we have a title which was inserted in the top margin, showing that the lost folios were lost very early on. In fact, Peter of Poitiers has a rather nice letter, 2 pieces of venerable, complaining that someone had lost yet another element of this, part of Peter's refutation of Islam, and Peter of Poitiers had to copy it out again. So it did happen as they were travelling. It's quite easy to do because these books, of course, were not bound by that at that point. They were just individual gatherings which could fall out. And then there are annotations as well. Some, as in the first one, are interlinear. As you see there, Incredulis, which are the first lines we saw before. Another, rather nicely, with that very strange paraph sign there, with the P, the double P almost, which spills onto into the middle of the column, and that explains that paraph sign. This letter is nothing other than the Arabic paraph. Incredulis there is glossed as those who do not take up or accept this law. These glosses constantly refer the reader to the meaning of the words within Islam, often making reference to this law, or pointing out that those criticised are either Christians or Jews or polytheists. One way of looking at this annotation is that it is completely redundant, since it keeps on repeating the same sort of idea. Obviously this is about Islam. We are reading the Quran, but the readership this is designed for was one steeped in Christian Latin. And it seems to me that what these interlinear glosses are doing, repeatedly, is ensuring that the reader does not assume that the verse means the same as if it were a Christian text written by a Christian. The glosses are, in part, an attempt to maintain the alterity of the text, even though, or particularly because, an attempt has been made to capture the meaning within an elegant Latin. So that's one type of explicatory gloss placed over the words in question. Sometimes it's simply a question of navigating what the text says. TB, to you, within the translation will often have "O Muhammad" above it, making it clear who is being addressed. Now, that's a technique you'll find inserted in modern translations of the Quran as well. Similarly, the words of Allah addressing Muhammad are introduced by Vox Dei or Vox Dei ad Muhammad. Since the Quran, and also its translation, is by force elliptical, these glosses have the force of punctuation and stage directions, and it would be nearly impossible to make sense of the text without them. There are longer annotations, however, placed in the margins. The first we can see, placed in the upper margin, indicates the importance of the book, its authority, the lack of criticism of it, and attaches a tradition associated with it. In part, of course, to illustrate this authority and specialness, but also, within a Christian context, to discredit it at the same time. And commentaries, or perhaps traditions, seem to be well mined, and they're used repeatedly to fill out or explicate the meanings of the text. This is an interplay between a module and an interlinear gloss, referring to the cow or heifer, which gives its name to the second surah. So, the first Latin saying, he invents that God ordered such a cow to be killed, so that when someone was murdered secretly, as soon as he was touched by a part of the cow, he would revive to reveal his murderer. Then, interlinear gloss, strike him with a piece of the cow, reads the Quran. and there is the interlinear note. So, with a tail, according to some, with the shank, according to others. The marginal glosses may offer a potted summary of doctrine or authorial intention. Glossing here, you just see on the first line, Vos item filii Israel bonorum quevoris conturi. You too, sons of Israel, remember the favours I have favoured you with. That's 240. The marginal annotation offers. Here he makes God speak to the Jews and almost reprove them for their unbelief, in that they do not believe in this law, which was sent to them as an addition to the law of Moses. And so it goes on. The annotator is clear that it is Muhammad who is writing the text, and so seeks to establish the motives for its various increpations, exhortations, and narrations. Sources for unfamiliar stories are occasionally sought, for example, from the Jews, who have an infinite number of untrue tales, which he has without doubt changed, or evoking history, glossing prophetas, prophets. We get prophets. He calls himself and his companions, whom the good Christians who are in that land, Hijaz presumably, resisted as much as they could. Such notes, of course, are destined towards a full-scale refutation of Muhammad's prophetic claims and of key beliefs held by Muslims. In part, it is guidance and background information for the reader, but also preparation for the composition of a refutation. And Peter of Poitiers is fundamentally involved in Peter the Venerable's 2 works against Islam. Now, who wrote the glosses? It doesn't seem to be the translator. Consistently in the translation, the word for just as if is written velud, V-E-L-U-D, with a D at the end. In the marginal annotations, the word is always, as far as I've been able to see, velud, with a T at the end. Other differences may well arise, but it's probably Peter of Poitiers putting all this together. That explains why sometimes there's a difference in quality, that sometimes the information may be coming from one source or another, or Peter might just be inventing it. Repeatedly through this, the word storta and ridicula come up. Storta is usually translated as stupid, but it has a whole range of meanings, from totally mad to foolish. But really, what those annotations are doing, it seems to me, is that they're drawing attention to a claim of irrationality, and to give, as it were, a marker for something which would be used to show that the scripture, or the Quranic scripture, is not divinely ordained or revealed. Now, what I'd like to do is look at the text Afterlife. It was the translation of the Quran for the Middle Ages. It exists partially or completely in over 20 manuscripts, many of which are 15th century, although these already give witness to a wide transmission in previous centuries. You probably you can times 20 by 10 probably to give the number of manuscripts. Nicholas of Cusa, in preparation for his own Libratio al-Qurani, annotated his own copy, which is still extant in his library. Just when, in fact, he was instructing Gottfried Reisner to discover the truth about the death of Magister Eicardus. Very good book, this, written by someone from this parish, in fact. Did you mention his Quran in the book?
No, I did not.
Oh well, maybe a second edition then, maybe?
It's fiction. It's fiction. So.
But perhaps Robert's greatest success was through the translation's central position in Theodore Bibliander's 2 printings of anti-Islamic material in 1543 and 1550. Now, Bibliander was a Protestant academic. He was eventually dismissed from his chair of Hebrew. who published a great deal on Oriental matters. And the Muslim threat, or rather the Turkish threat, weighed heavily on Christian minds at the time. Bibliander's edition of Robert's translation, in the 1543 version, you can see here, uses several manuscripts and maintains some of the annotations we've been looking at. Although these are consigned to the end of the volume, together with, interestingly, manuscript variants. It's an extremely interesting editorial labour. And he wrongly thought the annotations were not part of the not part of the original text, which is why he puts them to the end. This text caused scandal in Geneva when it was printed before it got permission to be printed, and Luther and Melanchthon were actually involved in supporting Bibliander in the publication. And so the 1543 has at least 3 imprints whereby material sent by Melanchthon is published in the preliminary matter. First of all, attributed to Luther, and then when they get a bit of Luther, they actually properly attribute it to Philip Melanchthon. Now, it's reprinted in 1550. It's not as good quality. But Bibliander does without the variants and follows what he thought was the best manuscript, one copied in Constantinople, indeed, for a Dominican. Looking at from the beginning and end of the text trajectory, which is what I'm doing now, he was probably not right to adopt that manuscript. And the text over 300 years has obviously decayed. There's lots of omissions, there's lots of misreadings, we can say. Here is one from down the road. It's a Selden manuscript. And it's probably Selden himself, as you can see that annotation there with the asterisk next to it. It's probably Selden himself who preferred this late 13th century English copy for the monastery of St. Edmund to Bibliander's printing. The text is very good in this, it must be said. As you can see from this slide, Bibliander himself supplied marginal annotations in italic at the side of the text. Many of these are just place finders, noting mention of individuals or events of the text. Others, however, are precisely motivated, finding the source of Quranic passages in biblical verses. Bibliander's argument was essentially that much of the Quran was simply the Bible distorted, or contradictions, particularly where the Quran speaks of war and killing, or where it urges tolerance. The text, as I said, weighed heavily upon Protestant consciences. And other marginalia are anti-Catholic. Muhammad is like a monk, for example, or purgatorium ut in Ireneo, purgatory, just as it appears in Irenaeus, or identifying the most abstruse heresies with various elements of Muslim doctrine. Now, these printings were widely read and studied, annotated, sometimes with phrases of interest in the original Arabic. The edition of this text became an important scholarly tool throughout Europe. Now, it's often said that because Bibliander's works appeared on the Inquisition's Index of Prohibited Books, the Quran was not studied in Catholic Europe. This certainly wasn't the case. The work was censored, but mildly, and I'm making my judgment from the copies I've been able to see in Rome. Melanchthon's prologue, produced due to the unwillingness of the Geneva City Fathers, I was said, to countenance the publication of a heretical work like the Quran, or diabolic work like the Quran. Now, Melanchthon is always removed. Anything by Melanchthon or Luther would be. Bibliander's prologue is not, however, and very, very few passages in that is censored. The text of the Quran is left wholly intact, and only a few of Bibliander's more contentious annotations are removed or abbreviated. He has a go at bishops, for example, which gets taken out. One copy, which is exceptional, does not touch any of those annotations, but does remove Bibliander's introduction. Probably that was because it was simply less work, which is one reason one way of looking at how the Inquisitors went about their job. There is actually, in the Vatican Library, there is actually the Inquisitors' report on Viviana's book, which runs to about 50, 60 pages. All of these Roman texts are annotated, sometimes with the equivalent of NB, but evidence of some form of attempted reading, nonetheless. Well, what does all this tell us? I think we can say that at a certain social and intellectual level, Western European Christendom's engagement with Islam was continuous, intense, and given the obvious linguistic barriers, remarkably well informed. If we think back to the mention of the Muslim paradise, which opens the annotations to the book, this knowledge of, what can I say, Islamic doctrine may well have made it easier to accept the Islamic philosophers, really Aristotelians writing in Arabic, since they were clearly not proposing anything recognisably like the Islamic idea of paradise. I think that's quite important. And that sort of thing, that clear difference, allowed Dante to imagine them, pagans all, together with Aristotle, outside hell, in an eternal version of, well, the seminar. I didn't say outside hell. Now, this view of Islam is, of course, partial. Any view of any religion cannot but be. The importance of Robert's translation was felt immediately from Cluny in the 12th century, was taken on later by Dominicans and Franciscans, particularly in the East, was prized by intellectuals such as Nicholas of Pisa, or the unnamed 15th century annotator of the manuscript held by the Vatican, who was enormously interested in logical consistency. And, with a new lease of life breathed by the printing press, read all over Europe by Catholics and Protestant scholars alike. And it was from this text that the first non-Spanish translations of the Quran were made into Italian, Dutch, German. Peter the Venerable's legacy, and that of his translators and commentators, was huge, particularly when compared to what happened to his other gains from Spain. When he reached Salamanca, Alfonso VII offered him San Pedro de Cardeña, which was a monastery just outside Burgos, which rather fittingly was the grave, the site of burial of the Cid. He probably left Peter of Poitiers there to oversee what was essentially a stripping of the monastery. Anything movable was taken out of it and taken back to Cluny. That was obviously the deal with Alfonso VII, because Alfonso VII actually accompanied them back to the monastery, to San Pedro de Cardeña, to oversee the handover. Cluny held that monastery for 4 years before they were thrown out by the locals. This project was put together while Peter the Venerable was waiting for the results of a siege. And that may have influenced Peter in his view of the importance of, can we call it dialogue? Perhaps not, but at least of peaceful argument, which was different to the bloody business of the crusade. And here again, it's another example of how the abbots of Cluny and the monastery itself, and therefore the daughter houses, were on a very different track to the direction that the papacy was then going in. The Cistercians were very much behind the papacy, and they, in a way, are the ones who were successful. But Peter was trying to cut a different track and trying to avoid, in many ways, the business of armed struggle and replace it with discussion and debate.
Thank you very much. So we have some time for discussion.
I just have 2 questions about this text. It's a very interesting text. So one is, I was wondering whether readers of this version of the Quran would have been aware that the original was actually poetry. So does anything of that come across in the
Some bits of this are rhyming.
Okay.
So that there is a.
Does it actually preserve the lining, like one rhyming line in Arabic becomes one rhyming line in Latin?
No, it doesn't do that. Some of it is very, very strongly marked by rhythmically and by some forms of rhyme, but it is not consistent, and that, in a sense, it's a bit of gilding the lily there, I think. Because really I don't think they're that interested in.
So that might correspond more to the literariness of the Latin rather than
Yes.
trying to preserve something in the original.
Yeah. It's what you'd expect to read.
Right. The other question I had is, you mentioned that some of the marginalia sort of refer to, I think you said traditions, and I was wondering whether you meant hadith, and if so, was there any kind of transmission of information?
Well, I specifically didn't say hadith because one assumes that what they are doing is they're translating with commentaries to hand. They're clearly well connected into the Muslim communities, particularly that they're found on the Ebro. That the Ebro itself, some of the lower reaches, were thriving Muslim communities, and that they're very old, very well respected, and very well staffed, and so well staffed, in fact, that they can survive very happily in Christian domination. So they have very, very strong resources, it would seem, to maintain their identity. So they must be using something. But also, given the example that Peter Poitier says about, well, I heard this from both Peter Toledo and Robert of Ketton, it does seem that they are, well, Peter Toledo, it's quite normal. He's a Moss Arab living in what was probably never a majority Muslim city, but a city with a great deal of Muslims. And Robert must have learnt his Arabic somewhere, so they've both lived amongst Muslims. So there's also that formation, I think, as well, which gives them an insight into Iberian Muslim society. So there's 2 things. Some of it is very bookish, and I think some of it is just this is what they do.
I want to make one kind of general point and talk about your own presentation. I mean, it strikes me listening to everything this afternoon and reflecting on the Aquinas and the Arrows project and everything else, with a kind of theological perspective, how what we're looking at this afternoon can actually be of use for the positive encounter of religions today. Then it comes across very clearly that what we're looking at is a fruitful encounter on the level of philosophy of what we know as natural truths. And I think one of the powers of that, strikes me anyway, is that it does allow us to have a discussion across religious traditions, which doesn't get messed up with theological questions about the status of religious traditions. So, as we all know, kind of in theology of religions debates, the questions of salvation and salvific status of religious traditions loom so large. Well, one of the values of retrieval of this kind of debate is actually it allows you to see that there can be a discussion outside of that. And without getting bound up with those kind of judgments. And I think that kind of comes across, just in a second, what you were talking about, Anthony, as well. And I just wonder, I mean, just then moving on to your point, you kind of mentioned about the approval of Arab philosophers precisely because they could be seen as being outside of the Islamic tradition. And I wonder, I mean, just if you could say a bit more, I mean, within the kind of material you're looking at and the tradition, do you pick up on much comment on the philosophical interaction? I mean, even is there any comment on Aquinas' interaction with Arabic thinkers within your more translating and polemical tradition?
Well, you do get it with Nicholas of Cusa. But I think it is significant. I think that it's the Summa Contra Gentiles which marks the end of references to Averroes. Something has clearly happened to Aquinas at that point, whereby there is something going on there, in the sense that, probably mistakenly, I think they do become things to be defeated, rather than philosophers to be worked with. I don't know whether you. I mean, it seems very striking that he abandons reference to. I mean, there may be political reasons for that as well. That no longer can you actually ban the name Averroes around. That's, you're going to get into a lot of trouble, and it's really not worth it because you can maintain the argument without using the name.
It's not generally true that he stops referring to Averroes. It's just that he stops referring to Averroes on this one issue. And there's someone pointing to this. I mean, I think until he died, he kept talking about Adamson and Averroes.
Oh yes, certainly. I mean, even as late as 1272, he's talking about.
But is it approbatory? Is it saying, these guys have got it?
No, it's not. These guys have got it. No. No, he's passed beyond that. He's making use of it. He's calling attention to what he's critical of. But there might be another reason for this dropping out, and that is it might just have been too confusing to, on the one hand, to refute his natural epistemology, on the other hand, to draw on his model for supernatural epistemology. It strikes me that he may just have decided, well, the doctrine stands on its own. We don't need to keep mentioning this because it's going to confuse people. That's a possibility, I think.
I think one other thing to bear in mind here, not to tread too much on your stuff, but one other thing to bear in mind, I think, is that when Averroes and even to some extent Avicenna are used by Aquinas, he's using them because they're helpful guides to understand Aristotle. And so they're kind of salient, not so much as Muslims as Aristotelians. And to some extent the rise and fall of the approbation of Averroes and Avicenna, I think just tracks the rise and fall of fondness for Aristotle. Although with Averroes there are specific issues about his theory of the unity of the intellect and the eternity of the world, and maybe a couple of other things that people get really nervous about. And so that's why Averroes in particular becomes a more kind of contentious figure, but I think he continues to be used pretty widely, doesn't he, for just like, well, the commentator says Aristotle means this, so prima facie that's what Aristotle means, unless we're talking about the unity of the intellect or the eternity of the world.
Martha Bordeaux is working with the Leonine Commission now, and she's done some really quite valuable work, and she's tentatively put forward the thesis, which seems to work pretty well, that Aquinas was well aware that Avicenna was not commenting on Aristotle, but rather developing his own philosophy, and Averroes was explicitly commenting on Aristotle. So she puts forward the idea that Aquinas is very much taken with the philosophy of Avicenna and the guidance of Averroes in understanding Aristotle. And it often works. quite well. But he's also aware of the places where Averroes diverges considerably and offers his own views different from what Aquinas sees in Aristotle.
You know, this afternoon, the thing that I'm struck by is how, in terms of Aquinas and in the West, the reception, in one sense, of, quote, the Arabs. But I'm curious in terms of how were, quote, the Arabs received within the Muslim tradition. I'm not familiar with that. The other question that I have, too, is that what was it within Aristotle that made, quote, the Arab philosophers and someone like Aquinas and others in the West find a common idiom or a kind of common text to be working with? What was it that Aristotle afforded both of these great religions as a way of rethinking? You know, not necessarily a total reform, because my sense is perhaps the Arab thinkers that we're looking at, there's a distinction between the piety or the popular piety of people. So I noticed I triggered a reaction, so I'm curious.
Let's flip this one, shall we? I'll take the first one. You think we had I think Eastern's
Are we going to wrestle in the center here?
You asked whichever one you want.
Okay. Well, during the lifetime of Averroes, philosophy was banned on Lucy. The ruler that was favorable to Averroes was Abu Yaqub Yusuf, and his son who succeeded him was very different. And there's a little bit of an element of theology in this that I think people often miss, relating not directly to Averroes himself, but to the times. And that is, after the Ibn Tumart al-Mahdi and the rise of the Almohads, that whole process it involved the establishment of a theological school at Marquette. And everyone who was going to be involved in the inner circles, and there were multiple circles following Berber tribal circles and that sort of thing, everyone who was going to be in the inner circles had to be educated in theology at Marrakesh. And this might have been why Averroes himself went to Marrakesh when it was pretty clear that the Almohads were taking over, just to get the lay of the land and get his foot in the door. Joseph Puig-Montada recently has a piece that came out on Averroes and the Almohads. And he shows nicely that Averroes never got himself involved in the inner circles. And maybe he wasn't trusted quite enough because he had done something pretty nasty. That is, he had attacked Al-Ghazali at length with an awful lot of hubris in the incoherence of the philosophers. And Al-Ghazali was a popular figure. And so this was fairly offensive, but he won the argumentative battle, so to speak. But people continued, I think people continued to be somewhat upset with him. So Puig-Montada's evidence is that he was never inside these inner circles. So while he might have been consulted by the Caliph on various things, which he was, by Abu Yaqub Yusuf, nevertheless, it seems that Averroes may have been a favorite of that particular Caliph, who had some philosophical training and liked what was going on. But when the Caliph died and his son took over control, some interesting things happened. There's a story that when the Caliph finally came and arrived at Cordoba, the theologians were delighted because finally he was going to slap down at Averroes. And instead of the Caliph did, this is the son of Abu Yaqub Yusuf, and he said to Averroes, he said to Averroes, come up here, come up, approach the throne. And they had a nice conversation, and everybody was happy. And Averroes went away pleased. They were shocked by this. Well, not much later, the Caliph banished Averroes, and a little bit before that, he'd also banished philosophy as well. Now, people do all kinds of interpretations involved in this too. But I like a sort of a different interpretation. That is, the reason he didn't have Averroes' head cut off, as he had other people's heads cut off, was he was his father's favorite. And so when theologians were making trouble and wanted Averroes beaten, head cut off, or whatever else, he said, yeah, just get out of town for a little while. Wait till things cool down a little bit, I'll banish you. There's no reason to believe the banishment was torturous or anything of that sort. It's an old man at this time. And then after the banishment, well, why don't you go to Marrakech? Well, it turned out that at Marrakech, by that time, shortly thereafter, after Averroes went to Marrakech, the Caliph resigned and went to Marrakech. He went to Marrakech to pray for forgiveness for his many sins. So there's this theological element in those Almohad caliphs that's very, very important to them, that the people surrounding them had to be steeped in theology. Perhaps they're also superb fighters, which many wouldn't, the caliphs themselves were. But this, I like this idea then, they sort of paused and said, whoa, I've been a little rough on the world and people here. I better go pray for my soul and other things for a few years. And he went to the same place where Averroes was. There's no reason to believe they had an interaction, but there's a certain piety there among people who can be violent rulers as well. So the custom has been in the olden days, for us in the olden days, that philosophy died with Averroes. Well, it's just not a chance. Occasionally I run into students who have read some of the old texts and that sort of thing, and they tell me, yes, and Al-Ghazali defeated philosophy, and with Averroes it's last breath and that sort of thing. Not at all. What Al-Ghazali did with the attack on the philosophers was introduce philosophical terminology and argumentation into theology. Quite the opposite of attacking the philosophers. It did the opposite. It made theology much more philosophical. And it carried on. Post-Avicennian philosophy flourished. And so there's no stopping philosophy. It's just that it was banned in Andalusia, and successfully enough that there was no school following Averroes. One last thing. On Averroes, I think that the classical rationalist tradition, which Peter's going to talk about in a minute, the classical rationalist position reached its absolute ultimate pinnacle in self-destructive. Averroes says on page 10 of the commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics that we should worship God with the most appropriate kind of worship that there is, and the highest kind of worship is to worship the Creator and His creatures with the very best science of the day. The best science of the day is philosophy, and in philosophy, the very best science that grasps the very nature and being of the Creator is metaphysics. And so there is a Sharia, a religious worship specific to the philosophers, and that is to study metaphysics, and that is the very highest kind of worship. It seems to me that's rationalism gone to its pinnacle, and it's time to just implode, because now, since for Averroes there is no afterlife, he's lost all sense of what religion was about for people. It's a different kind of thing, and I think that ultra-rationalism just imploded ultimately by itself. But
well, so I mean, just to pick up the story, I think it's important to remember that although Averroes is really, really important for the Latin Christian tradition and also for the Jewish tradition, he's not important for the Muslim tradition. And one sign of that is that things like the long commentary and the De Anima are not extant in Arabic, but they are extant in Latin or Hebrew or both. And these are, some of his most important works. So he's a very marginal figure, both geographically, because he's all the way out there in Spain. Sorry, Spain is it's the edge, right? And the real action is back east, and back east. I mean, in a way, I think there has been a kind of killing off of philosophy, but of Aristotle at the hands of Avicenna, not of Avicenna at the hands of Ghazali. So Avicenna is such a huge figure that his impact on Islamic philosophy is like the impact of Plato on Greek philosophy. So after Plato, all Greek philosophy is responding either to Plato or to Aristotle, who's responding to Plato. And similarly, after Avicenna, Islamic philosophy is all about Avicenna, except for this one weirdo or a couple of weirdos out in Spain who are still into this Farabian project of reading Aristotle at the time, as if that's still cutting edge. but it's a really kind of reactionary project that Averroes has embarked on. And I think that's another reason he doesn't have the impact that he might have. He's kind of doing something that's a century or two out of date at that time. And so what you get in the East is this long tradition of integrating Avicenna into Islamic theology, which is called Kalam. You have commentaries on Avicenna, commentaries on the commentaries, the super commentaries. You have integration of Avicenna into mystical traditions. So really everything you could possibly do with Avicenna, including making up texts and ascribing them to him that he didn't write, that all happens after Ghazali, really.
And also a tradition of philosophical commentaries on the Quran.
Yeah.
Starts with that.
So I mean, and that keeps going right through the time of the European Renaissance and beyond. I mean,
It just strikes me that there needs to be a healthy caution when we look to this period as somehow a model of great dialogue between these religious traditions, when in fact really what it was the interlocutor of Aristotle's metaphysics in one sense that caused the Latin West and through the Arab writers and that to be brought into the Western tradition probably more effectively than the West to the East. So it's,
I think that's really very important. That's right on the mark. Because I was talking about philosophy, and I didn't say, look at the influence of Islamic theology on Aquinas. There might be a point or two worthy of pursuing there. And there's a little bit of very little literature on this, and some of it not very good. But no, this is really what I was after when you picked up on.
yeah.
That was really after positive cultural connections, positive, similar, common religious interests, and then that there really wasn't much of the dialogue. I mean, these things are. It wasn't. I don't think the Quran was translated so that we can read it and we can then have religious dialogue and chat. It's really to have that control.
But then one last word, and this is to draw back in on Nicholas de Cusa. I think that there is an attempt on his part, and not an expert in Nicholas, but there was, I think, more of a dialogical way of approaching Islam and Christianity. And so maybe that's something that, in terms of looking at models and paradigms, to see what he has to say.
Just one quick follow-up on that. For today, for people who do the counting, I think it's true that the number of books in Arabic that have been translated into European languages is humongous compared to anything European translated into Arabic.
Not true. We talk about the modern era now.
Yeah.
There was more books translated from European languages into Arabic than actually written to start with in Arabic.
Okay, we must draw things to a close. Thank you very much. Thank you again to our earlier speakers, and thank you to our most recent speaker for his contribution. As I said at the beginning, our hope is that this will be one of a series of, we've stolen Aquinas and the Arabs as a title. We haven't put in the quotation marks yet, but we better do that as well. We hope that this will be the first of a series of seminars on topics in this area. If you're not on the mailing list of the Aquinas Institute and you would like to be, then just put your email down on a piece of paper and give it to me, and I'll add you to the list. But thank you very much. There is, if you have time to stay further, a glass of wine or some juice in the cloister before you go. And thank you again to Tony Lappin.